This is Brian Russell, philosophy professor at Bakersfield College, and today I'm talking about evaluating arguments. The first thing I'd like to do is discuss what we're trying to accomplish when we're evaluating an argument. What are we trying to accomplish when we're evaluating anything? We're assessing the value of something. We're assessing its worth. So when we're evaluating an argument, we're trying to determine whether the argument is good and we should accept the conclusion on the basis of the argument, or whether it's bad and we should not accept the conclusion on the basis of this argument. So how do we do that? To evaluate an argument, you need to ask yourself two questions. First, are all the premises in this argument true? Second, if all the premises in this argument were true, would they provide enough support for us to believe the conclusion? In order for an argument to be good, the answer to both these questions must be yes. If the answer to either of these questions is no, then we must reject the argument as bad. So let's delve a little bit more into this first question. When should we consider the premises in an argument true? One time when we should consider the premises true is, so when should we consider an individual premise true? When it's the conclusion of a good sub-argument. Sometimes you have sub-arguments that support individual premises in an argument, and if that sub-argument is good, then we'll accept the conclusion, which then becomes a premise of the main argument, so we accept the truth of that premise as a demonstrated premise. Another time when we should consider a premise true is when we have good reason for assuming that it's true. In this case, we say the premise is assumed. So when should we assume the truth of a premise? When its truth is easily observed. So if it's something that we can immediately see or hear, or something which we've recently observed. When it's a statement by an appropriate authority. So who counts as an appropriate authority? Well, appropriate authorities have degrees, publications, jobs in a relevant field in which they're making their statement. Another time is when most or all the audience believes it. So if the Pope is speaking to an audience of Catholics and he used a premise, God is good, that would be an acceptable premise for his audience. If he was speaking to an audience of atheists and he said God is good, then we should not assume the truth of that premise. The final case I want to talk about is when we need to assume the premise is true for the sake of argument. There are multiple times when this might pop up. So one time when we might assume a premise for the sake of argument is when we can't determine whether the premise is true or false. In that case, we just assume the premise for the sake of argument and move on with our evaluation. Another time we might want to assume a premise for the sake of argument is when we know it's one of our opposition's strongly held beliefs. So if we know we can't shake them of that belief, we might assume this belief for the sake of argument and see where that leads. We might do this especially if we were trying to shake our opposition of a further belief. We can't shake them of this premise, but we might be able to demonstrate to them that this premise leads to results contrary to what they believe. So we might assume a premise when we need to assume it for the sake of argument. Now getting to the second question. How much support do the premises need to give the conclusion in order for us to judge that the premises give enough support to the conclusion? To give a precise answer to this question, we would need to know what type of argument we were dealing with, inductive or deductive. If the argument was deductive, then the premises would need to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. And then we would say the premises give enough support to the conclusion. If the argument was inductive, in order for the premises to give enough support to the conclusion, we would need to see that if the premises were true, they would make the conclusion more likely than not. In this class, we're not covering this inductive versus deductive distinction. So for our purposes, let us just say that in order for the premises to give enough support for the conclusion, it would have to be the case that if the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be more likely than not. So let's take a look at some practice arguments. Here's the first. Premise 1, San Francisco is either in California or Nevada. Premise 2, San Francisco is not in Nevada. Therefore, it is in California. Does the argument have true premises? Is it true that San Francisco is either in California or Nevada? Yes. Is it true that San Francisco is not in Nevada? Yes, that's also true. So the answer to the first question, does this argument contain all true premises, is yes. Then we have to get to the second question. If the premises were true, would they provide enough support for the conclusion? So if it were true, both that San Francisco is either in California or Nevada, and that San Francisco is not in Nevada, would that make it more likely than not that San Francisco was in California? The answer to that is yes. In fact, if these premises were true, they would absolutely guarantee the truth of the conclusion. If San Francisco was either in California or Nevada, and it was not in Nevada, the only place it could be, if the first premise is true, is in California. So what should we say about this argument? We should say that this argument is good because it has all true premises, and if the premises were true, they would make the conclusion more likely than not. In fact, they would guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Let's look at another practice argument. If the moon is made of cheese, then there are mice on the moon. The moon is made of cheese, therefore there are mice on the moon. First question, are all the premises true? Premise 1 says, if the moon is made of cheese, then there are mice on the moon. How do we evaluate this conditional statement? It's actually a little bit strange. Maybe we'd have to ask ourselves, if anything is made of cheese, are there always mice on it? That doesn't seem to be the case, so maybe we should say this premise is not true. But it turns out we don't really need to evaluate the truth of premise 1 because we can skip to premise 2. The moon is made of cheese. That is false. So our answer to the first question, does this argument have all true premises? No, it does not. So we already know this is a bad argument, but just so for the sake of completeness and to show you how these questions can be pulled apart, let's look at the second question. If the premises were true, would they provide enough support for the conclusion? So if it were true that if the moon is made of cheese, then there are mice on the moon, and if it was true that the moon is made of cheese, would it make it more likely than not that there are mice on the moon? And the answer to this is yes. In fact, again, if these two premises were true, they would guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So if it were true that if the moon is made of cheese, then there are mice on the moon, and the first part of that, the if part of that statement, we knew was true, then if premise 1 is true, the then part would follow. There would be mice on the moon. So what do we say about this argument? Well, while it's the case that if the premises were true, they would provide enough support for the conclusion, it's not the case that all the premises are true. So this argument is a bad argument. Let's look at another example. All elephants are mammals. All dogs are mammals. Therefore, all elephants are dogs. First, are all the premises true? Is it true that all elephants are mammals? Yes. Is it true that all dogs are mammals? Yes. So the premises of this argument are true. So it passes what we might call our first test. Then we have to ask the follow-up question. If the premises are true, would they provide enough support for the conclusion? So if it were true that all elephants are mammals, and if it were true that all dogs are mammals, would it follow? Would it be more likely than not that all elephants are dogs? Certainly not. So it's the fact that one group of things falls in another group of things. Let's substitute variables here. Just because all A's are C's and all B's are C's does not make all A's B's. Now, if this argument was different, it might work. So if this instead said all elephants are mammals, all mammals are animals, therefore all elephants are animals, then we would have a good argument. Then that would be all A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's. But as it is, just because A's are C's and just because B's are also C's, that doesn't mean that A's and B's are the same. So even if these premises were true, they would not provide enough support for the conclusion. So what should we say about this argument? It's bad, and we need to reject it. Even though all the premises are true, it's not the case that if true, they would give enough support for the conclusion. Another practice argument. Just one premise here. Joan of Arc was an atheist. Therefore, she believed in many gods. So first, are the premises true? In this case, is the premise true? No. Joan of Arc was not an atheist. You can look up that information. It's readily available. But then we have to ask the second question. If the premises were true, if the premise was true, would it provide enough support for the conclusion? If she was an atheist, would she have believed in many gods? The answer to that is no. If somebody's an atheist, they believe in no gods. If she was a polytheist, then she would believe in many gods. So the premise is false. Not only that, even if it was true, it would not provide enough support for the conclusion. So what should we say about this argument? It's bad. It's really bad. It fails both of our tests, and it should be rejected. So far we've been dealing with only deductive arguments. Let's look at how this plays out with inductive arguments, even though in this class, again, we're not going to be making that distinction. So, premise 1, a recent Hill-Harris poll of 948 registered voters found that 67% support Medicare for all. Joe is a registered voter, therefore Joe probably supports Medicare for all. Does this argument have true premises? Well, you can look up whether premise 1 is true. In fact, I provided a link here that I won't go to right now. And that is what the Hill-Harris poll showed. Is premise 2 true? Well, I made up Joe. Let's imagine Joe is a registered voter. So the premises here are true. So then we have to ask the follow-up question. If the premises were true, would they provide enough support for the conclusion? So, to answer that question, we would need to know a little bit more about how this poll was conducted. But Hill-Harris polls, they're a regular polling outlet. They don't seem to have much bias. They try to be accurate with their polling. They polled 948 registered voters, assuming they had a diverse group in that group of voters that they polled. Then we would have to say these premises would provide enough support if true. So if it were true that out of 948, 67%, that's a large majority of registered voters supported Medicare for all. So if Joe is one, he probably does support Medicare for all. So he's more than 50% likely to support Medicare for all, or it's more than 50% likely that he would say that he supports Medicare for all, would be another way to say this. So what do we say about this argument? It has true premises, and if the premises were true, they would provide enough support for the conclusion. In other words, they would make the conclusion more likely than not. So we say this argument is a good argument. Another example. Every map of the United States shows that Alabama is on the Pacific coast. Therefore, Alabama must be a western state. Are the premises true? Is it true? Or is the premise true? Is it true that every map of the United States shows that Alabama is on the Pacific coast? Well, consult the map. It does not show that Alabama is on the Pacific coast, so the premise is false. So we already know the argument's bad, but let's look at the other question for the sake of completeness. If it were true that every map of the United States showed that Alabama was on the Pacific coast, would it follow that would it be more likely than not that Alabama was a western state? The answer to that is yes. If every map showed it, then it would probably be the case that Alabama was a western state. So what do we say about this argument? Well, the premises are not true. But if the premises were true, they would provide enough support for the conclusion. But still, the premises being false is enough for us to say this argument is a bad argument and we should not believe the conclusion based on this argument. Another practice argument. MLK said, "I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic. Capitalism started out with a noble and high motive, but like most human systems, it fell victim to the very thing it was revolting against. So today, capitalism has outlived its usefulness. Therefore, capitalism has outlived its usefulness." So first we need to ask, is the premise true? In fact, it is true. I provided a link here, but I'm not going to follow it right now. You can look it up yourself. He said it in a letter to Coretta King. Second, we need to ask the question, if the premises were true, would they provide enough support for the conclusion? So, just because Martin Luther King Jr. said that capitalism has outlived its usefulness, should we believe that capitalism has outlived its usefulness? What we're asking is Martin Luther King Jr. an appropriate authority about capitalism? Martin Luther King Jr. was very educated about economic systems, but I don't know if we want to consider him an expert on economic systems. Who would count as an expert? Well, somebody who has a PhD in economics or political science or both. The issue with taking anybody's word for it on this is experts may disagree. In fact, experts do disagree on whether capitalism has outlived its usefulness and should be rejected in favor of another better system, or whether we should continue on with it. So because experts disagree, we can't take any of the experts' word for it. We have to consider the arguments on their own merit. Is him saying it, that capitalism has outlived its usefulness, is that enough for us to believe that it's true? No, it's not. So even if it were true, it would not make the conclusion more likely than not. So what do we say about this argument? Does it have a true premise? Yes, it does. If the premise was true, would it provide enough support for the conclusion? No, not by itself. We would need more information to come to such a sweeping conclusion. So, what did we learn today? We learned how to evaluate arguments. What does that mean? Evaluating an argument just means assessing whether or not the argument is good or bad. In order to evaluate an argument, you need to ask yourself two questions. Are all the premises in this argument true? And if all the premises were true, would they provide enough support for the conclusion? We also talked about in order for an argument to be good, the answer to both of these questions must be yes. If the answer to either of these questions is no, then the argument is bad and we must reject it.